I'm going to get to the main lecture today. I'm going to, of course, talk about the background of ancient Egypt, kind of just talk about the early history of Egypt, kind of go into like the culture of Egypt, its geography. We'll talk about a lot about that, which is kind of important about Egypt. And we'll talk about the Nile River because, the Nile River, is really kind of instrumental in part of why Egypt exists, kind of still does today. That and you got the Suez Canal now. Of course, tourism is also big too in modern Egypt also. But anyway, if you have any, of course, comments, questions about the lecture, do let me know during the live stream, or you can always leave me comments on my channel. Also, students can also leave me comments in Canvas discussions as well online. So anyway, let me talk about some of the main things about Egypt we'll get to, of course, first. Yeah, there you, of course, see an image of the pyramids. That's the thing that most people think about when they think of ancient Egypt. Those massive tombs that were built, of course, which really were built during the Old Kingdom. The Old Kingdom was probably one of the most famous periods of Egypt. But really only the fourth dynasty we'll talk about like later in the week is the one that really built the most largest and most famous of the pyramids, like the Giza pyramids, of course, that are right near Cairo, of course, today. So that's what people more think of when they think of Egypt. And of course, then the tomb of King Tut and all that is also kind of big in Egyptian history as well. But ancient Egypt's civilization is pretty long. It's a type of civilization that does go back thousands of years. I know it's not as old as like Mesopotamia, some of these other river valley civilizations that we've talked about before, but they do date back to at least 5,000 to 6,000 BC is about how far back they think Egyptian civilization started. Like in prehistoric times, although most of Egypt today, like the part we know about that we'll talk about this week and next week, most of the ancient Egyptian civilization peaked in the Bronze Age. That's when they were dominant as a culture, when they were more independent as a state, but they later got taken over by other powers. Here's kind of an image, of course, of Egypt. So Egypt's kind of located in North Africa. Part of it is also in Asia, like the part where the Sinai Peninsula is. It's actually in the southwestern part of Asia. So it's kind of a transcontinental state between Asia and Africa. It is part of the Arab Republic of Egypt. That's the official name they call the modern state of Egypt, which, by the way, has about 100 million people that live there. So it's a pretty large populated country. I think I looked it up, 14th populated nation in the world. Of course, its capital, Cairo, today, but it is famous for other cities you've heard of. Alexandria, which is on the Mediterranean Sea, later started by Alexander the Great, years later, a long time ago. And then also, don't forget Luxor, it's more on the bottom, southern part of Egypt, as well as also another major city, which a long time ago they called it Thebes in ancient times. But let me get to the main thing. Of course, I want to talk about the importance of the Nile River, to ancient Egypt. If you think about the Nile River, it's very important geographically, not just for modern Egypt. Of course, it's important for a lot of trade, especially with that, and you've got the you got the Suez Canal, which is, of course, right there. It goes into the Red Sea as well. But in ancient Egypt, a long time ago, it gave birth to civilization. So, without the river, there wouldn't have been anything there. Because if you know about Egypt, not just in ancient times or in modern times, it's mostly desert. Like I want to say 90% or more of Egypt is desert, and they only actually cultivate a small percentage of the land, especially along the Nile River basin. But you can see, besides farming, they use it for fishing, trade, and economics. So it acted as kind of a highway system where it connected the northern part of Egypt with the southern part of Egypt. So you had things like that where the river was important. Also, like it's a food source, fish, crocodile, things like that. They get skin from the crocodile as well. Papyrus, type of hedge plant that grows, of course, in the Nile, was used to make paper. So those are all things that, were important, of course, But it wasn't the Nile, wasn't just the Nile, the Mediterranean Sea, like above, if you go to that map right there, you can see how the Mediterranean Sea is above, Egypt and the Nile. They also traded, throughout like the Mediterranean. Like I know with the Greeks and the Minoans and peoples like that, they do. Then also trade like in East Africa, like close to the Red Sea and past all that, like into Ethiopia, Somalia. They were trading in those parts of Africa, and also down into the Sudan, which is later also called Nubia in ancient times. So yeah, river is very important. You can see that's the length of the river itself. The Nile River is roughly over 4,100 miles in length. That includes its tributaries as well in Africa. It is the longest river, not just in the world, but also in Africa. You can see. But you see only 22% of the Nile's actual course runs through Egypt. The rest are in other countries. Like I think the other countries it goes through is like Ethiopia, parts of Sudan, and I think Uganda also you can include as well. And the river is kind of interesting because it flows, if you know about it, from south to north. It starts around the equator, flows northward, going down toward the Mediterranean Sea. I think it's like several thousand feet above sea level where it starts as it flows down towards, of course, where Cairo is today. I'll get more into the actual the Nile River itself. A little bit about Herodotus. Herodotus was one of the first to write about Egypt. I think I talked about Herodotus before, how he was one of the first to write a series of books about history. They call it Histories of Herodotus or History of the Persian Wars. And in book 2 of his histories, he wrote kind of an extensive history of Egypt. The reason why was because the Persian Empire conquered it. And so that was in the 6th century BC. And so he wanted to include kind of a history of that. There's actually stories where they think that Herodotus may have actually gone to Egypt, like went there, visited it. And his most famous quote he said about Egypt was, you see there, Egypt was the gift of the Nile. And so what he meant by that was the fact that he felt like the river had kind of given birth to the civilization because it helped, facilitate, I guess, development of agriculture, and agriculture led to civilization. And so hence that term, of course, kind of coming about because of that. However, the ancient Egyptians thought that the river was the flood, like the annual flood that came in the summer, every year, was caused by a god, which I'll get to later. I think the god was named Hapi. I think it was the name Hapy or Hapi. And so they thought the gods caused the flood, but in reality, it was actually the monsoon seasons that hit parts of Africa, East Africa, that actually caused the rivers to swell up and flood. But they didn't know that, of course, a long time ago. So there's Herodotus, like when I said, one of the first traveled to maybe Egypt. And he actually wrote about the pyramids, things like that. We'll talk about later. Wrote about mummification, things like that. And he's really the oldest source really on those kinds of things. Here's another view of, by the way, of ancient Egypt and kind of where it's actually located. So if you know about Egypt, it's divided into 2 areas. They have an area which is the upper part of Egypt, which is the southern part of Egypt, actually, where the river begins. It's more down to where Karnak is, and really the city of Luxor is on the bottom. Aswan High Dam and all that's down there as well. And then the northern part of Egypt is what they call the lower Egypt, which mostly is like around the Delta area. So Saqqara, Giza, Cairo, and all that would kind of be included in those areas that you're looking at. So that's how they usually do it. I think there's kind of a middle Egypt that's kind of between lower and upper Egypt, but people don't use that term much today. But that's just geographic terms that they often talk about with Egypt, not just in ancient times, but I guess in modern times also. Here's a kind of another view also of Egypt. I think it's kind of a mix of modern, ancient terms also on there as well. But you see all the different cities that were there some long time ago, like Memphis, of course, was one of the capitals of ancient, like administrative capital, like ancient Egypt. And then, of course, you have Cairo, which is kind of right nearby. Of course, the main capital of Egypt. You can see Alexandria, which, of course, is also where the delta is on the Mediterranean Sea. They have. I'll kind of talk about it now. Now, since we're talking about the Nile, the term Nile is derived from Greek, from the word Nilos, which I think there's different theories about where the name came from. But I think the Greeks kind of viewed Nilos or Nilus as like some kind of river god of some type. So that's, they think, where the term actually came from. And there's different variations of the spelling. So Nilos, Nilus, and Nile, I think it was an Arabic variation of it that they have. And I think there's been some debate about what it meant in Greek. I've seen some terms where it says it means the river or great river or great canal, might be a translation of it. But that's not what the Egyptians called it. I think there's some belief that the Egyptians named it after the actual Egyptian god of the flood. I told you, Hapi. They think that's actually what they called the Nile a long time ago. You can see the river empties out into a large-sized delta, which a lot of rivers do, like the Mississippi River, like in Louisiana, which the term delta, if you know about it, evolved from the Greek alphabet. The letter delta, which you may have seen, looks like a kind of a triangle, and so it's kind of a triangle shape to it. You can see where the river flows into the Mediterranean Sea. The Nile Delta has two main branches. The Nile River Delta, there's one branch called Rosetta that you see is kind of on the western side of it, closer to Alexandria. And then the other one is called the Damaida branch, which is more to the eastern part of the delta of the Nile. And I'll get to it later, but that's where they get the term Rosetta Stone from, because that's where the Rosetta Stone was found, that little town that's in the delta, Rosetta, today. Here's more of an image from outer space, kind of showing you what the Nile River and its delta looks like. So most of the rest of Egypt is desert. You'll see sometimes some oases that are kind of out there, that are outside the river, like the Fayum, I think, oasis, which is kind of to the west of it, right there. Those are just images you'll sometimes see, of course, of the river. Here's another view, of course, of the Nile with the different countries that it kind of goes through. It does have two main sources of the Nile. That they have the Blue Nile and the White Nile, which the Blue Nile starts in like Ethiopia and flows into Sudan, and then of course they meet together with the White Nile, which the White Nile they think starts way down in Uganda, but they think it actually goes all the way down into Lake Victoria. Lake Victoria, and so most of the river, like the source of the river, I don't know if you know much about the Nile River, but the majority of the water that goes down the Nile comes from Ethiopia, like the Blue Nile. I think there's been some controversy between Egypt and, of course, Ethiopia with them trying to stop some of the water flow going into Egypt. I think I've got some other views right here. The river does, after it forms that Khartoum in Sudan, the blue and the white now meet, converge together. And then from there, it form one trunk as it goes up into northern Sudan, upper Sudan. And there's like these so-called cataracts that the river down, which are a series of waterfalls. The word cataract is a Greek word, cataracta meaning waterfall. And a long time ago, a lot of the British back in the 1800s were some of the first to actually explore that area. Like you may have heard of Dr. David Livingstone and Henry Stanley Morton, I think were famous for kind of exploring that area of Egypt in modern times. And so they numbered it backwards from 1 to 6. They had to climb up a lot of the waterfalls as they went up into Sudan, actually. They went more up, of course. So it's kind of talking about the cataracts and It's very hard to navigate, of course, the Nile as you get into Sudan because of all the, not just the waterfalls, but it's got a lot of rapids and also sometimes go down the Nile as well. Here's other images kind of showing, it's kind of how drastic the Nile is. So you could have 1 foot in the desert, like in the kind of desert areas, and then you got the fertile areas along the river. So it's only along the river that the Egyptians cultivate a lot of their crops throughout Egypt, except maybe certain oases I was talking about. And in ancient Egypt, they called Egypt Kemet, which meant the black land, which because of the fertile soil of course of Egypt, which was a natural silt that flowed from the river. They used that to grow crops throughout Egypt, and so that's the name that they used. And then I think later in Greek times, the word Egypt is supposedly a variation of the word Kemet. So you're kind of looking at that right there. They also have what they call Deshret as well. You'll sometimes see that term being used also as well, Deshret, which is like, I think I've got that term, I'll put on the screen right here for you, but Deshret is a term that talks about, well, it's 2 different things. It means red land in hieroglyphs, but it talks about how the different parts of Egypt, like the deserts were like what they call that. But it was also a term they used for the lower part of Egypt, especially around the Delta area, because I'll get to it later, that Egypt kind of separates into 2 states, an upper Egypt kingdom and a lower Egypt kingdom. The lower Egypt kingdom was called Deshret because the king wore a red crown. So they call it red land. But the desert areas were often called Deshret too, which mostly were infertile. Here's kind of another image so you can see how drastic the difference, like I told you, is between basically the fertile areas and the areas that are, of course, not. And you can see it from Google Earth. Like, look at Google Earth, of course, of Egypt. You can pretty much see the same thing. What kind of crops did they grow in ancient Egypt? That varied. But they're kind of almost similar to like what they grew in Mesopotamia. But flax is something they grew a lot in ancient Egypt, which flax was used to make linen, which is a type of cloth they use, which they use that for clothing. They put it on the mummies and all that too, like the mummy wrappings on the mummification thing they did. Use that for wheat and barley were kind of considered like their main grain crops, along with sorghum. So those 3 right there, where a lot of that, like wheat and so on, were used to make like bread, which is a common staple, especially for the lower classes. Papyrus, which I already mentioned about, which is like a hedge plant that grew in the Nile, was used to make paper. They also made boats out of it, like reed boats were made from it. Of course, date palm, which they used the date. The wood from the tree was used for different things. Sesame was grown like in Mesopotamia. Figs, different kinds of fruits and vegetables were also grown throughout Egypt. So kind of similar to like what you see in Mesopotamia as well, kind of crops that are being grown. Here's kind of a image of like the different growing seasons that they had in ancient Egypt, which there was only like 3 main growing seasons they had the most. The one at the top, which usually goes from about June to about, it says about October, is what they call the Akhet. The Akhet was the most important season they had in Egypt. It's actually supposedly means in hieroglyph inundation, not flooding. And when the river would gradually increase in water, rise up by many feet. And depending on, how much water they got, that dictated basically what kind of growing season they were going to have. So if they didn't have enough water, it would be a drought, possibly, that could happen. Also, if it flooded too much, it could obviously flood like cities and villages, which was another problem they could have as well. They also have what they call the Peret, which is the sowing season. where they would kind of plant crops basically during the year, which that mostly happened during, I think the months they had for is like October to February would be when they would plant crops, which some of those like could be obviously plant some in the fall, plant some in the spring. So let's debate about that when they would plant, because most people plant crops like farmers or whatever usually 2 times a year, once in the spring, one in the fall, and also harvest too. Same thing. We'll harvest some things in the fall and harvest some things in the spring. So that kind of thing. So yeah, they have like basically 3 growing seasons, but kind of like in Louisiana, we're close to the equator. It's pretty warm there also year round. So they don't really get a winter. Sometimes we get snow here, but it's once every a bunch of years. That we have snow very rarely. So we're almost like subtropical Louisiana. And so, yeah, Egypt is kind of close to the equator, right above it. Yeah, there's kind of an image showing the Nile River, by the way, flooding. So, yeah, up to like I think the 1950s, 1960s, the river would flood. So they'd have problems with flooding. They'd have to deal with. They didn't have a levee system like they had, like we have, like in Louisiana, a lot of along the Mississippi River, we have like this levee system that we built to kind of prevent all that kind of flooding. But the Egyptians had this thing they built along the actual river called a nilometer. I don't know if you've ever heard about these, but nilometers were like these flood towers that they built along the Nile to measure like the flood stage of the river, so they could figure out what kind of flood season they're going to get. And it would go into this tower structure, and they could measure how high the water was going to be for that year. So they could figure out if it was going to be a drought or if there was going to be too much water and it might flood towns or villages. And so they knew it was going to flood too much. They could then evacuate cities and villages. But what happened, these nilometers became obsolete. When they built the Aswan High Dam in the 1960s, it made a lot of those obsolete because they can control the flooding now more. So anyway, that's kind of discussing about that issue. Let me get next, and I'll kind of just for a few minutes talk about prehistoric Egypt, which, yeah, they do have some prehistory of Egypt. They kind of just mentioned for a short time about that. Egypt itself does go back a long way. So 7,000 to 8,000 years ago, they think Egypt may have started in prehistoric times. I would put it kind of, during the Neolithic period. They think farming started 5,000 BC, maybe the furthest back. And it's believed that predominantly farming started in that Fayum oasis I showed you, which is kind of to the west of the Nile. So that's, they think, where it started from. And then over time, the Egyptians spread up and down the river from like the delta down into the upper part of Egypt. So it took a while for this to actually happen, but it did. And Egypt was not really a unified state. It was a collection of city-states, which were called a nome, or nomes, if you want the plural version of it. And the word nome derived from local chieftains that controlled each city-state, which was called a nomarch. And so the term kind of stuck. Now, I think the term nomarch is kind of where the Egyptians get these like chancellors or viziers that kind of control the state, which are later like under the pharaohs that are kind of ruling as governors. Yeah, at one point there are 42 of them that actually control all of Egypt, but eventually they unify as like a kingdom or an empire. I think I've got some other images kind of showing the difference. Yeah, there, of course, the difference between Lower Egypt and Upper Egypt. Again, I'll kind of get to that in a second and talk about because they do have different states that are comprised of what becomes, Egypt. However, let me classify first who the Egyptians are. The Egyptians were considered, today anyway, back then in ancient times, they're considered Afro-Asiatic peoples, more the Hamitic part of peoples that are in North Africa, And we talked about like the Kushites, I think was one group, the Berber in Egyptian would kind of be all classified as kind of similar cultures that were in North Africa, but they're multi-ethnic. So it's like, they always talk about this idea of black and white Africa, like up in Egypt, that kind of thing in North Africa. But they really weren't. They were more homogenous races, because you'll see people dark skin, light skin, that kind of thing. Especially in North Africa, there's just mixes of different peoples that are a mix of probably Semitic, African type peoples that are everywhere. In Egypt today, it's still like that. Although I think Egypt's mostly Arabic, the people that have settled there. But Egyptians, you'll see different colored peoples that are light skinned too. You'll see like people like my color, and you'll see people like almost like African also as well. And yet other people came in, like the Europeans came, like the Greeks settled there, Romans came in later, Arabs eventually came in, Turks, I think, also came into Egypt also as well. Now, I want to get into and talk about the different states back in prehistoric times, like at the end of the, they think the new Stone Age, Neolithic times. They do think there were two states that evolved into kingdoms, which may date back to, I don't know, they're not sure how far they go back to, 3500 BC. But they had two states. They had the so-called Lower Kingdom or Lower Egypt that emerged, which would be in the northern part of Egypt today, where the delta is. That king had a red crown that he wore, which was called a deshret. And then they had what they call the Upper Kingdom or Upper Egypt, which the king wore a white crown, and so they call that crown a hedjet. And some of the Egyptians, I think, may have called it like the Lower Egypt. They call it the Red Land or Deshret, I told you. And then they actually did sometimes call the Upper Kingdom or Upper Egypt the White Land. So they kind of use those terms because of the different crowns that were being used. I think I've got an image of the different crowns also as well. So the one on the left you see is the white crown I'm talking about. Which I told you is called the hedjet, and then the red crown, it's called the deshret, and each one has a symbol. By the way, the Lower Egypt, of course, has a vulture as main symbol on the headdress, of course. Then the Upper Egypt's kingdom's crown, the red one, has a cobra. So a vulture and a cobra right there. The two different ones. Then they combine them later. You can see the crowns, and it's red and white, with the white on top, with the red, of course, on the bottom. They have different names. They call the double crown, if you want to know it. I don't know if it's that important, but in ancient Egypt, they called the double crown Shemti, I think is the common name they would say in hieroglyphs. And then the Greek name is, I think they pronounce it skent or something like that. It's how they said it, basically. And that's the different names that they called the actual double crown that was worn by the pharaohs that later come to power, of course, in Egypt. And they do think there was a king that unified Egypt. You see there, his name was King Menes, who I'll get to later, has another name. They also called him King Narmer also. Let me explain the term pharaoh, though. The term pharaoh, which is, the name that they use for the kings of Egypt, that term was not used until the New Kingdom. They don't really use it until later. I want to say the 19th dynasty, I think, was the dynasty they think started using it. Anyway, the term pharaoh supposedly was actually where the actual king ruled from. Supposedly the word pharaoh meant great house or royal palace. And so that later became the name that they called the rulers of Egypt. So pharaoh. And so that particular pharaoh we're talking about that unified Egypt, his name was King Menes, who you see there. the first major pharaoh of Egypt. He does have different names. The Egyptians themselves had their own name that they called him, which was Narmer. And then the Greeks later called him the name Menes. Also, there's a third name. I think there's two Greek names. There's Menes, which is more popular. And there's another name, which is Men, either M-E-N or M-I-N, I think is a variation of how it's also spelled. And so you'll see a lot of the pharaohs have two different names. They got the Egyptian hieroglyphic name they find later, and then they have the name that the Greeks call them also. Usually I'll put those in parentheses or something like that. Here's kind of an image of Menes, by the way, and of course what he did as a pharaoh. So he's really considered to be the first king of what they call the first dynasty of ancient Egypt, which I think Egypt had something like 31 dynasties at one point. There's a debate about when he reigned. So they're not sure, like 32nd century to maybe close to the 30th century BC. They're not sure like when he was around as a pharaoh. They do think that he was a king that reigned in the upper kingdom, upper Egypt, and he took over Egypt and he unified it into one state. So you see, the first pharaoh to unify upper and lower Egypt into one kingdom is the main thing that Menes, of course, would do. And then he created their capital. I told you about Memphis being the administrative capital of ancient Egypt. That's the location of where he would basically put his main palace that he would reign from. Thebes would later arise as a major city too in Egypt, but that won't happen till like around the middle to New Kingdom when it becomes like a center as a capital. But it was more of a cult center more than anything. So he starts to facilitate trade throughout Egypt, connecting the different states and provinces throughout Egypt. And then, of course, he was one of the first to wear the double crown. I was told you where he took the white and the red crown and he combined them together. There's this thing called the Narmer palette that was found in Egypt, I want to say in 1897 or 98. And it's a type of cosmetic palette that actually depicts Narmer's or Menes's reign. So they do think he was a real ruler of Egypt. I think they had other pharaohs of Egypt that they kind of know about a little bit about, especially the upper kingdom. But they think a lot of those, some of those might be mythological. So they're not sure if they're real or not. But they do think he was real because of this, archaeological fact. This stone artifact that was found by British archaeologists. And what it does, it actually depicts not just Narmer, but him unifying the state. I think I've got a slide here showing you some of the things that's on it. So on the left, it shows Narmer with the crown of Upper Egypt. And then on the right, he's got also the crown of Lower Egypt that he's wearing. So he goes from basically conquering the lower part of Egypt. And then I think it shows him like beheading his enemies, of course, on the right with that as well. And so I think it has some brief hieroglyphics on it as well. So this type of stone artifact is considered one of the oldest of its kind from ancient times. Might be one of the oldest stone artifacts ever found. So it's kind of debate about when it dates to, but like I said, maybe close to the 30th or 31st century BC may have been when he reigned as ruler. But they consider it to be like the so-called pre-dynastic period of when Narmer or Menes reigned, which I think is the first and second dynasties, because the third dynasty is the one that starts the Old Kingdom, which is later. Now talk about it for a few minutes. They do divide Egyptian history, like ancient Egyptian history, into different historical periods. The main ones, of course, that we'll talk about the most is the Old Kingdom, the Middle Kingdom, and the New Kingdom. I'll probably try to get into some Middle Kingdom too as well this week. Actually next week. But Old Kingdom, you can see there it's when the pharaohs kind of come to power and they began to consolidate the state into a centralized government. And of course, they build the pyramids. At the peak of the pyramids, of course, were constructed at that time, which the most famous we'll get to later is the Giza pyramids, which were mostly built, of course, by the Fourth Dynasty, the most famous dynasty, of course, of the Old Kingdom. However, the country struggled later. You can see power struggles, crop failures, the cost of the pyramids eventually caused the collapse of the Old Kingdom, and it did. Middle Kingdom came back later, so you can see the different periods. Old Kingdom was like early Bronze Age, 26th to the 22nd century BC. Middle Kingdom's more like 21st to the 17th century BC. And you can see how several things happen under them. But one big thing you see there, they start trading with different people. So you see they trade different parts of the Middle East. Crete with the Minoans, start trading with Minoans and all of that. Also, I'll get to it later, but pyramid building kind of stops at that point in the Middle Kingdom. Thebes becomes kind of an important city as well. It kind of becomes almost like a capital of Egypt during the Middle Kingdom. And then at the end of the Middle Kingdom, they get invaded by these peoples called the Hyksos, who are based in the Levant, where close to where Israel, Lebanon is. They actually get occupied, especially in the lower part of Egypt. Then they have the New Kingdom also as well that comes in later between the 16th and 11th centuries. And that was really the peak of Egypt, especially at the end of the Bronze Age. And their state becomes more like an empire. I think some people call it the Pharaonic Empire or New Empire of Egypt, where it expands all the way into Syria to the Euphrates River Valley. You got Hatshepsut, we'll get to later. Queen Hatshepsut is kind of a famous female ruler they have that reigns. She encourages trade, especially in East Africa, well known. Also, you got a lot of famous rulers like King Tut, Tutankhamun, that kind of comes in later, more known for his tomb they discovered in 1922. Then Ramses the Great was like one of their peak rulers they had, of course, but Egypt after that began to decline. I've got even more extensive, like you can see here, it's kind of the Egyptian timeline. They do break it down into different periods. They have these so-called intermediate periods that kind of occur between the three major kingdoms. First intermediate period, second intermediate period, third intermediate period, where Egypt kind of breaks up and there's a lot of chaos throughout the period of their history. And then you have these other periods that kind of like the late period. Egypt's declining and they're occupied by foreign powers you get the Assyrians come in at one point, Persians, Greeks, Romans later occupy their history also as well. So, but most of Egypt's, I guess when they're most powerful is predominantly in the Bronze Age. When the Iron Age comes in, they start declining. That's one thing that happens. Now, let me talk about also religion as well, which the Egyptians drastically had a lot of gods. They had probably a couple thousand gods. I know we'll kind of get into some of the ones that were the most famous that they had. You can I'll kind of show you some right here. You can see, but some of the ones that are famous, you can see in that list: Isis, Osiris, Ra, Horus, Anubis, Sobek, Thoth, Hathor, Amun, and Set. So those are some famous gods you can see there. Of course, King Tut right there in his tomb on the right in that image with that slide. But they had different gods. Their chief deity, the one that was the most famous, is the god Amun. Amun became part of the state religion of Egypt. In fact, you get up to the New Kingdom, the cult of Amun-Ra, or cult of Amun, as they call it sometimes, becomes like a state cult religion, which is centered in the upper part of Egypt, in Thebes. It becomes like a major city of Egypt later, where Luxor is today in Egypt. That's where they had this huge temple they built, which was like something like several hundred acres in size, called the Temple of Karnak, or Karnak Temple Complex. And Egypt over time became a theocracy where they had these pharaohs that were all powerful, but in reality, the religion controlled the land more than anything. But Amen was considered their most powerful god. In fact, the word Amen means, supposed in hieroglyphs, the hidden one. It later was merged with the god Ra, which is the Egyptian sun god. And so later they kind of view these gods as kind of being the same or similar. But also the fact that the Egyptians kind of viewed all of the gods as almost like manifestations of Amen Ra. Like any god you're talking about, they're all kind of linked to each other. The Greeks saw Amen as like Zeus or Jupiter to them. So they saw it as this all-powerful god, God, the father of all the gods. And so a lot of the Greeks would often call Amen or Amen Ra Zeus Amen. I think Alexander the Great and others probably called it something like that. Of course, other chief gods they had too that were famous. Anubis, you've kind of seen before, was the so-called jackal head god of ancient Egypt. He's mostly associated with like Egyptian funerary practices, like embalming of the dead. He's kind of like a judge of the dead too in the afterlife. And so the Egyptians kind of connect him to a lot of the rituals and processes of when they would bury people and things like that. Because quite often, a lot of the priests that would do that would wear a jackal mask that represented that. A lot of their gods are anthropomorphic. You'll see them like part animal, part human. And jackals are kind of like hyenas, kind of, scavenging off the dead and things like that. Other gods they had, Horus was a very important god in Egyptian mythology. Horus was often seen as the god that was the embodiment of the pharaoh in ancient Egypt when the pharaoh was on the throne. And he was mostly several things. He was a sky god. He was a falcon god. He was part falcon, part man. He was also a war god. I kind of compared almost like a Egyptian version of maybe Mars or Ares. He was the son in different kinds of mythologies, either the son of Osiris and Isis, or also sometimes the son of also Ra and Hathor. So there's different variations of who his parents are. I know Osiris and Isis are more popular. But usually when the pharaoh was on the throne, he was seen as a living god, like Horus. And then when he would die, he would kind of become like Amen Ra. So quite often, a lot of images, you'll see Horus with that double-headed crown, like the red and white crown we talked about, of course, that kings would wear as well. They also have Isis. They also have Hathor, which is kind of similar. They're kind of similar goddesses to each other. And both those goddesses were kind of seen as these chief goddesses of like fertility, of course, but also things like sex, marriage and women, and also alcohol, like kind of a goddess of brewing that we've talked about before as well. Usually when they see Isis, and I think Hathor is kind of similar looking, she'll usually be the image of a woman with cow horns above her head, where the cow horns, I think, represent like fertility. That's her giving eternal life to, of course, Queen Nefertari, who was later a famous wife and queen of Ramses the Great. The Ankh is a symbol, of course, of eternal life, because the Egyptians believed that your soul was eternal, that it maybe couldn't die, especially if your body was left intact and mummified. They also have Osiris. You may have heard of him. He's well known in Egyptian mythology. Might have been one of the oldest gods that go back to like the Old Kingdom. Osiris is like the god of the underworld in Egyptian mythology, or king of the dead, if you want to call it. And there's beliefs in the ancient Egyptians that Osiris was believed to be like a king that lived a long time ago in Egypt. It's also a god of fertility. And he was married to Isis. I told you that fertility goddess that's well known. And so their main son is believed to be in some mythology, of course, Horus, of course. And there's a famous story which is well known in ancient Egypt, which is called the Osiris myth, which is this mythological story that tells how Osiris goes from becoming this king of Egypt that lived like a long time ago. Maybe he lived in prehistoric times, I don't know. And over time, he became resurrected as the king of the dead. And what happened in the story was he had this brother named Set who wanted the throne of Egypt. Set later is kind of viewed as this Egyptian god associated with things like chaos, deserts, infertility, and also storms as well. And he seized the throne by murdering his brother. He killed his brother, threw his body parts, I think, into a chest and put them into floated them on the Nile River. And of course, what happened in the myth, if you study about the story, Isis recovered the body, his body parts, and had him mummified. It's one whole, I guess, body basically. And so the Egyptians believed that if your soul was going to make it into the next world, like underworld or whatever, you had to be intact. And so that's why everybody wanted to be mummified, etc. So I guess he's considered the first to be mummified. And so you'll see a lot of images of him being mummified, like on the right. He's got the double-hatted crown, of course, also the crook and the flail. You'll notice that those are symbols of a lot of the pharaohs of Egypt that they'll have like across their chest. I think you see it with like King Tut when they opened his actual coffin in the Valley of the Kings. But I think they say it represented the fact that maybe a long time ago the ancient Egyptians were shepherds, which is kind of that's connected to like a whip and a crook there. You see, like we're shepherding like sheep or whatever. And so they think that's where that originated from, the actual symbols. There's Set. They think he may have been some kind of cat god in ancient Egypt mythology. There's a debate about whether he may have been a king too. At one point, maybe took the throne for a while. But what happened was Horus, who was the son of Osiris and Isis, fought Set for the crown and defeated him. And so that's why the pharaohs of Egypt became connected to Horus instead. Also, there's another guy you may have heard named Thoth or Thoth. It's pronounced either way, I guess. He's a famous bird god in ancient Egypt who's connected to like writing and wisdom and knowledge, also mathematics and science as well. And he's this moon god that they say gave the Egyptians papyrus that grew along the Nile River, which they used to make paper out of. And so they think he gave them like writing, like hieroglyphs, like to write their ancient language down as well. And so he's kind of an important figure in also ancient Egyptian mythology. So it was like kind of like a white crane bird, Thoth or Thoth. Oh, you may have heard of Sobek. That's also another kind of popular god as well. That's well known. Sobek, of course, is mostly a god associated with the crocodile god in ancient Egypt. And I think they say the power center of Sobek, you see, was at Fayum, that oasis I told you in city, which is kind of west of the Nile, where they think Egypt may have started a long time ago, prehistoric times. But the crocodile is important. They use it as a food source. They use the leather as well. It also represented supposedly the pharaoh, like the power of the pharaoh, male fertility, And then also I guess the Pharaoh's armies was also associated with that particular god also. But yeah, the Egyptians had many gods. That's just some of them that were well known. They may have had hundreds, and they may have worshipped at one point. But I know, like the chief god we'll get to later, like at Karnak at Thebes, was Amen, and Amen was, like I said, I'll tell you, the state god and cult that pretty much ran the country. The pharaoh becomes more like a theocracy, his power. Let me get into one more thing today. I want to talk about also mummification as well. That's something that the ancient Egyptians, of course, are very famous for, where they embalm people, of course, for the afterlife. And the proper name they use for mummification is Egyptian funerary practices. The term mummification, I'll kind of explain to you, it's kind of an accident. It kind of came about more into modern times. But the actual knowledge about how the ancient Egyptians buried people is gotten from Herodotus. So you see in that image, Herodotus has the oldest accounts really on how they buried people in ancient times. And kind of show you right here this image here, but this is from like book 2 of Herodotus' Histories of Herodotus, where he kind of goes into some of the things of how they basically would mummify people. And of course, one of the things he talks about is that they, of course, would remove the organs. It's one of the first things that they would do from the body. They remove the brain. According to Herodotus, they would use some kind of iron hook or some kind of hook. It may have been bronze, where they would basically remove your brain through your cavity, through your I guess through your sinus cavity behind your nose, and they wouldn't keep that though. So as they would throw the brain away, basically, and then they would cut the side of the body. You can see there, cut them with a flint knife of some type, and they would remove all the contents of the abdomen. The only thing they would keep in the body, supposedly, was the heart. They would keep that in the body because the Egyptians believed that in the afterlife, your heart would be weighed. I think it gets a feather or something like that, the so-called weighing of the heart, where Anubis would judge you in the afterlife, how if you were good or bad, that kind of thing. Your soul could still be destroyed. If you were like evil person, or maybe your body wasn't intact and things like that, that could happen as well. He says then they would cleanse and wash the body out. You say about these wine, maybe, and spices, maybe that may have been used. And then they would fill the body with different things. He's got different ideas of what they would fill inside the body. Pure myrrh, it's kind of been a debate about what myrrh is. I think some people think it was some kind of tree resin they may have used inside the body. Cassia is like cinnamon bark is what it actually is. Other perfumes. They may have stuffed linen inside the body too, as well. And then they would place the body in what they called natron for 70 days. I'll get to that in a second. But natron is a type of mineral salt that they would cover the body in to kind of dry it out. Which mineral salt is kind of like similar to baking soda. And I'll get to it later where it was found. It was found in the deserts of Egypt. But that was the longest aspect of the actual. I think it took 70 days total to basically do the mummification. Body is washed and then wrapped from head to foot in linen. They would wrap the body in linen bandages, basically. And then they would put some kind of coating on the outside that was kind of like a glue, but they think it was some kind of like a type of resin that they used, which I'll explain kind of was made out of like asphalt material. Then they would take the body and they would put it like maybe in a like coffin or chamber, that kind of thing afterwards. So he kind of goes into how basically people were mummified, they think. But I think there's a theory that there may have been some kind of embalming handbooks that actually told people how to, like priests or whatever, how to do the process. But now it's kind of missing. But yeah, they think that what they call asphalt or bitumen, which is kind of like a modern names they use now, may have been used in the actual mummification process. And later, it was also called by the Arabs mumia. Yeah, mumia. Mumia is a type of resinous bitumen that was used in all kinds of things. It was used in embalming. They used it in medicines. Like I think in the Greeks and Romans started using it to help heal like wounds and cuts and things like that. People also took it for internal medicine, like for stomach ailments and ulcers and things like that. I think for headaches too, believe it or not, mumia. I think they may have even put it on bone fragments, like fractures and things like that as well. But the term asphalt was a term that was coined by the Greeks. Asphaltos, I think was the word they used for it. And then the scientific name is bitumen that they have today. Some people also call it like a type of pitch, like a type of tar pitch or asphalt pitch as well. So that may have been the resin that they put on the outside of the mummy. And there's cases where they actually would take the outside of the mummy and grind it down and make it into like a powder. They could call it mummy powder, and people would take it as a drug, which was ineffective, by the way. Didn't really work. But people thought you could take it as a drug that could help heal you. There's, of course, that's the actual mummy of King Tut. You see that Howard Carter, of course, has opened. They think they poured it on the actual, like the actual mummies. They take the mummy and pour it on it. They think that's why a lot of the mummies are actually black looking, like so dark black looking, because of the mumia that was put on the actual mummies. Yeah, it's like say it may have taken up to 70 days actually to totally complete the mummification. I forget how long they covered the body in that mineral salt, but that was done for several weeks. But the actual process itself took, you can see, up to like 10 weeks. So pretty long time that it took. And like I told you, the chief embalmer would often wear the jackal mask, which represented Anubis, the god associated with mummification and embalming. Yeah, that's the natron. They talk about natron. It's called different names, which is the type of mineral salt that was used in the process to dry out the body, which is really one of the main processes that they used, which took the longest, which I think it took like something like, I think it would cover the body maybe in 40 days. So more than half the time they would cover the body in this whitish material. And it was called, they called it natron because of the fact that it came from this desert. Actually, not a desert, it was a salt lake, which is west of the Nile, called the Wadi Natron. And so hence the name being used. But today, natron it's still used today, like as a type of soap and cleaner and things like that. They use it for. It's very similar to baking soda. Not quite, but like sodium bicarbonate or something like that is, I think, what it actually is. So there you got kind of different mummies that you're looking at right there that they have. And they did have this deal where they had these gods that actually protected your organs. They were called the four sons of Horus. You may have heard about them. And each one of these gods would protect certain organs that would go into canopic jars, which canopic jars were these pottery jars where they put your organs into. So they probably put natron in that as well. And the four gods were Dalmatef, Kabesonef, Hapi, and Seti. So Dalmatef is the one that's on the far left at the top. He looks like a jackal. That one would protect your stomach organs. Kabesonef, which is on the bottom left, was like a falcon type god. He would protect your intestines. I think most of your lower ones. Hapi, which is to the top right, looks like a baboon. He, of course, will protect your lungs. And then Seti on the bottom right, which looks like a human, will protect your liver. It's spelled different ways, sometimes with an I, but it's just a transliteration of the hieroglyphs. So those are all the different gods. And I think they took the canopic jars and they would just put them in your coffin, is what they would do. There may have been some case where they put it actually inside the mummy, but I think they didn't do that much as well. But yeah, the Egyptians took it pretty seriously, the afterlife. They really thought there was an afterlife. They would even sometimes put in food and other things like that, drink that they would need for the next life. There's even a case where they put statues of like servants that they thought could come alive, and help them in the afterlife. Have even boats. Like some of the pharaohs built like boats they thought they would need in the next world and stuff like that. So now I'll get to it later. Some of the Egyptians even have what they call the Book of the Dead, which were like these spells and incantations that would help them, travel through the underworld. And I think by the fifth dynasty, they even started writing them on the walls, like so-called pyramid texts inside their pyramids. So yes, they really took the idea of the afterlife pretty seriously. And gods like Amun Ra, were kind of seen as eternal, etc. Now, next week, not this week and next week, I'll be getting into also talking about the different kingdoms. I know this week I'll mostly talk about the Old Kingdom, which is the age of pyramids. So we'll talk about the different pyramids that were constructed during Egyptian times. I'll get to the Middle Kingdom a little bit. I'll kind of just briefly talk about the Middle Kingdom, and then I'll move on to the New Kingdom, which is the peak period of ancient Egypt, especially by the time of the end of the Bronze Age. So we'll get into that, all the different famous pharaohs that of course, happened during that time period that were kind of in power. Also, don't forget, I think I've talked about this before, Canvas quiz on Mesopotamia. That's out still right now. That's something y'all, of course, need to wrap up this week, mostly get that done, of course, out the way, because later we're probably going to have some other assessments coming up, which will mostly be on Egypt, because I'm debating on whether this might be a major exam I might have on Egypt, since it is a 3-part lecture that I'm, of course, doing on that. So this week, next week, I'll, of course, be lecturing a lot about ancient Egypt. I think I miss Ashlyn. Hey, what's going on this morning? I just came a little late, but yeah, hey, what's going on this morning? So yeah, that's it for my main lecture, of course, on ancient Egypt. Doesn't look like there's any historical comments or questions, of course, about this lecture. But if you do have, of course, a comment, question, of course, about this lecture, you can, of course, leave one. Canvas discussions, of course, online, or also with this lecture as well on YouTube if you want as well. But like I said, later this week, I'll kind of move on to talk about some of the different historical periods of Egypt that are famous, especially the Old Kingdom, of course, with the age of pyramids. We'll especially talk about the Great Pyramid, which is really the one that was the largest one, of course, ever built in ancient. So that's it for today. Yeah, Sean, hope you have a great, of course, rest of the week, everybody. And y'all, of course, take care. So y'all see y'all later.